and it freezed over this year. So just we had this cold snap, and so the sunny days it's gone. I can only imagine like the middle's probably melting, but we had this
Oh,
glorious 3 weeks where everyone in the city was on the lake at the end of the day, and you would see people
oh,
having like picnics out there. It was very sweet, very sweet. Okay, it's
that's fun.
4:03. Here we go. Welcome to the Gravity Terminology Public Call. We're continuing our work on child maltreatment, abuse of non-elder vulnerable adults, and legal needs. It is the 19th of February, and here we go. And I'm Sarah DeSilvi, Director of Terminology. Next slide. We are grateful you're here. Everyone starts muted, but we unmute quickly because we're a small and focused group and we do a lot of talking and like amongst ourselves. Uh, all calls are recorded on and available on the Confluence after the call. And please do participate and join and talk and be part of the conversation so that we can have a more of a collective consensus conversation than a presentation. Our SMEs Many of our SMEs are here today, and our subject matter experts will, of course, be called in to offer their wisdom as we go through the slide content. Next slide. We are accredited as a data standard entity and through HL7 by the American the American ANSI, American National Standards Institute. And we, by that, are required to comply fully with federal and state antitrust laws. This doesn't usually occur in this meeting, but individuals speaking or providing written communications shall refrain from any discussion which may provide the basis for an inference that they've agreed to take any action related to prices, services, production, and allocation of markets, or any other matter having a market effect. Participants shall not discuss their pricing or others' pricing or any term that might affect pricing or fees, such as costs, discounts, terms of sales, or profit margins. And adherence to these guidelines involves not only avoidance of antitrust violations, but also avoidance of anything that might be construed as such. Thank you. It's just part of doing the diligent consensus work we do. Next slide. We are going to go through some brief welcome and announcements, including some updates after the Assistant Secretary for Technology Policy annual meeting we were at last week. We're going to go through very, very briefly Spring 2026 domain level set, and then we will be going in, starting with abuse of non-elder adult concepts because our SMEs are top loaded, and then they will drop off and we'll go into child maltreatment and legal needs and close with community homework and next steps. Next slide. Next slide. Um, when we were last here, we talked about a shift in data standard policy. And there is a set of data elements that are recommended as the United States core data for interoperability, and the draft version of the next core data set from the Assistant Secretary for Technology Policy was published, and we're in that comment period. And something that happened is that our goals, problems, and interventions, value sets elements were removed as core elements and included as examples. I know that sounds incredibly nerdy, but you can see it here. So it used to be that under problem data class, there was an SDOH problem data class. But now under problem, you just see food insecurity as an example. I'm pointing to the screen as if you can see that. Same thing with goal and same thing with procedure. We got a question when we were presented this a couple weeks ago, how that affects the bindings and the relationships within US core, because when the elements were within the data class specifically, US core mentioned them and talked about them in the implementation guide. And the request I got up and asked at the Assistant Secretary for Technology Policy the question that came from the meeting with the colleagues at ASTP who guide US core. The question was, is the inclusion of SDOH concepts within problem, goal, and procedure understood to be normative so that It's still to comply with US Core and US CDI, you still need to be able to represent these concepts. And the answer was yes. So, Mark Savage, wherever you are out there who asked the question, I got the answer straight from the horse's mouth. And then, in addition, there was a further question that I asked about the bindings in US Core because of our IG. I said, can this be understood to maintain the bindings and mentions to our content within VSAC and our data elements and the IG within those aligned sections? And the answer was yes. So if the policy dictates it as normative, the expectation is that US Core should interpret it as normative, and any examples that are in US Core should remain. So got the answer directly, still open for comment, and the comments are due on April 13th at 11:59. But that was reassuring to me. That was actually how we originally interpreted it, that is, they're moving from, novel to normalized, and that it wouldn't hopefully it wouldn't affect U.S. court. It doesn't seem to be. We do want to again note that, oh, lovely. Oh, okay, no, sorry. This is another hand. Yes, Lucy. Hello?
Yeah, Sarah, in your comments, I'm sure you've already thought of this, but I hope that you will stipulate the conversation, that you will recapitulate the conversation that you just had, that you just reported to us, saying, we understand this is true,
Mhm.
because it's not in writing. And so you want it to be in writing.
Correct.
And so you give them the language to put it in writing.
As
Okay.
mentioned in the USCDI V7 ASTP update.
Etc.
I got you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Because it's not self-evident to me that I don't know, the care about SDOH goals and so forth um has not been as evident, shall we say, recently as it was once.
Got it. Thank you. Um, okay. And then what I was going to say is the protective factors element still remains. And so what I want to note is anyone who wants to comment directly on the page for that element, elevating and supporting its use is it's much appreciated. And you can do that as much as you wish. The only thing that held it back from being assessed at a level one globally, protective factors, was the fact that exchange is emerging. But we know that our implementers were eager for the protective factor comments because they're already critically involved in exchange methods like the MCCE care plan or care plan initiatives across, or even probably PASSIO someplace. So anytime we can cite examples of protective factor concepts being exchanged, it'll help elevate that protective factor concept for consideration in USCDI next round. All right. Any other questions? Okay, next slide. And we have some fun things going on. We're still going through ballot reconciliation, the technical work stream. And then we do try to post the ballots that we're considering on the Confluence and on LinkedIn, so you can know whether it's your ballots under conversation. We're going to be focusing on state implementations of gravity standards at our next implementation affinity meeting in March, which is only an hour long. We're shortening them and making them more conversational. We are have some public presentations coming up at the State HIT Health Connect Conference, a great panel on states that have written gravity into policy and regulation. And it's moderated by our dear friend Tom Novak from ASTP, who is the Medicaid liaison from ASTP. So it's going to be Nebraska and Colorado, and then New York couldn't come, but our dear friend, my dear partner in the good, Corey, will be there. And we know there's just a host of other states that are out there implementing, and we do have that blog that we should link about our high level analysis came out in the HL7 Winter blog about all the states that have written gravity into policy, and there's a lot. So it's very interesting work out there. And then we, of course, will be at HIMSS We don't have a formal panel, but we are speaking at the HL7 booth. Our partners in implementation, Civitas, are there, and they're going to be talking about the work in New York and giving a general gravity update. Okay, next slide. And Susan's going to be there. So I know there's lots of people who are involved in gravity who have, oh, okay. Oh, great. Corey's saying, oh, thanks, Corey. Do you want to say anything more about that, friend, or no? You good?
Oh, we're good. I just think we had a nice list there we're iterating on that you can track along the tickets that we're following to kind of see if you're interested in anything, and you can find all of the issues that we're working on the page I just shared.
Thanks, bud.
Hmm.
Any other questions? Engaging in tickets and all that and battle reconciliation is really fun. I think at least it puts the consensus in consensus work. So we really like having engagement there. All right, here we go. Now into content. Next slide. Um, you know what, Grad, for those, many of you, I think most of you are known to us, but just in case I don't, some of you are new, we are a collaborative with the goal to develop consensus-driven data standards to support the collection, use, and exchange of data to address the social determinants of health. Next slide. Just a big thanks to our members. We do what we do because of this amazing governance group, which is combined with supporting members who help us financially. And then from a social justice model, we also again include community-based organizations and patients in that governance model. We are the only accelerator who does that. We're pretty proud of that and better, of course, for the CBO and patient representation in all the decisions that we make and prioritizations in the roadmap. Next slide. I will find that link. I will try. One of us will. We will get that to you. All right, so where are we at in our schedule of events for terminology? We are in what we call the identify phase. So we did publish the ever so nerdy terminology SDOH life cycle paper recently. And so there's this initial period of just thinking about what needs to be said. And that's the period we're in right now. We're going to be continuing that work today. We keep in that work all through early April. In the middle of April, we start to constrain and start to kind of manage the set of concepts that we've identified for inclusion in our master lists. And then we're all heading to the vote at the end of May. Next slide. Any questions on that calendar? And I'm sure someone is going to try to get um, someone's going to try to get that blog. Oh, great, Sarah B. She got it. Thank you, Sarah. Fantastic. Okay, next slide. And it's really fun. It was, and again, what we've heard since that, Corey and Corinne and I collaborated on this, that we missed states because we didn't know, right? So we were only able, of course, to understand states that had stated publicly that they represented gravity and policy and reg. And so the little map that we made, that Corey made, is about existing and emerging, already is out of date based on what we've heard from states around the country. So it's exciting. Next slide. We mentioned this last time, but we just wanted the level set for this intentional grouping. We always try to combine our domains thoughtfully because there's crosstalk across domains, and SMEs sometimes are actually in joint meetings. And so we have these two concepts that build off of concepts in interpersonal safety, child maltreatment, and abuse of non-elder vulnerable adults. Everything in parentheses, even the word vulnerable, is under exploration. Our brilliant abuse of non-elder vulnerable adults SMEs are on the call today, and hopefully we'll expound on what looks like a little bit of content on slides, but it involves a lot of thought. And then along with those two domains, we're representing concepts and legal needs. And we just know that there's a lot of work that we've done um, in the past that is relevant. Protective factor work, incarceration status, ACEs, concepts in housing and transportation insecurity and legal involvement there. So there's a lot of context within our prior domains and the literature there that is brought to bear on the domains we're addressing now. Next slide. All right. We're going to start with this, and our each of our amazing subject matter experts are here today. And again, it looks like a little bit of slides, but I happen to know that Shannon sent a late-breaking, amazing email with thoughts from our meeting this morning. So we're going to sit with these slides, and hopefully our SMEs will help us walk through some of the things we're considering. Next slide. These are our amazing subject matter experts. We are incredibly lucky. We have Dr. Jeffrey Hall, Dr. Ron Asierno, and Dr. Shannon Griffin Blake. Just immensely wise people who Asha and Sarah and I try to do our best to cast wide nets around their brilliance as they're talking and try to synthesize it. But very, very grateful for each of them, and each of them are on the call today. Next slide. Okay, so this is just some context, and again, all of it is emerging. When we say this is the first meeting we've had after convening our subject matter experts, and there's just a lot of conceptual conversation. What are we talking about? What aren't we talking about? What we need to consider, right? And so we're going to be noodling into some of that today, and then what types of information is appropriate. You're going to hear us talk about both like definitions, but also approach over the course of these next slides. So at base, the core use case that we set out to address was abuse of non-elder adults that triggers engagement with adult protective services, because we partially addressed engagement with adult protective services with elder abuse. And we knew we had to identify the other instances where APS is required for future work. And so that's now. This is a partial list of the things the subject matter experts have noted to date, and I will say this is a very partial list, and they were so thoughtful this morning. As I mentioned, they continued to talk after we convened via email. So definitions of vulnerability, dependency, and what situations qualify for reporting vary significantly by state. And you can go into the US DOJ link there, and it goes through all of the different Vermont's, Arizona's, Nebraska's, each of them trying to define and interpret their approach. Establishing vulnerability dependency as a risk benefit analysis given the challenge to patient autonomy, right? You're always weighing the risk of benefits of calling APS. Vulnerability exists on a spectrum of balancing risks and benefits. And vulnerability has common, and all of this is actually probably TBD, like it deserves editing based on the things that happened after the meeting. Vulnerability has common dimensions, physical, cognitive, emotional. However, it also needs to be seen through lenses of disability, power differentials, and capacity for agency. Yes, Lucy.
What about financial exploitation? I
Yeah, so
have
we,
actually encountered
mhm,
banks and financial institutions that have security protocols
mhm.
that strike me as having arisen because somebody told them they had to do this, that maybe there's a financial exploitation going on here. And so I have to do certain things to persuade those organizations that that's not what's happening. So is that at issue in this use
Mhm.
case?
I'm going to say yes. I'm going to take us to the next slide, and it's a next slide with
Okay,
a very small definition, and then what I expect the subject matter experts to do is to talk about all the nuances that are at play, right? Because
very good. Thank you.
yes,
Fine.
absolutely, right. So this is already outdated based on um, based on what brilliance was going on in the call. And then so what I'm going to do is say this, and then I just want our SMEs to come in because they are here and just help enrich this perspective. So what we came out of the meeting with, but is already evolving, is a definition of vulnerability for the purposes of our work that was independent of state level variation and aligned with the mission of caring for people and the lenses of being a mandated reporter, right? So we had like we kind of tossed aside all the state level stuff and said, what are we trying to say? So vulnerability is what this is, and this is already outdated. Vulnerability is a physical, emotional, or cognitive or other state. And other state, there's a lot, Lucy. Doot, 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 doot. that's in there that leads to a higher risk of abuse and or its consequences. And you can see that there's structural and systemic possibilities in there. And it needs to be considered within the type of vulnerability, the type of abuse, and it can be temporary, intermittent, or abiding. Subject matter experts, do you want to come and like maybe Shannon, you can come and talk about your reflections that you've had since the meeting, but maybe we can help bring everybody along to how we got here.
Well, it might be useful to think of, as I said earlier today, a reasonable person on the street example, and context matters.
Great.
So, if, for example, you have a person, doubly amputee in a wheelchair who works in a bank, and someone is emotionally abusive toward them, that doesn't actually, not talking about the wheelchair status, that doesn't actually speak to their vulnerability. Their vulnerability, their disability, whatever you want to call it, is not relevant enough to violate their autonomy, for example, and report that to police or bring in adult protective services. However, if the form of abuse leveraged or exploited their vulnerability, the fact that they were in a wheelchair, then it might well become a compelled reporting example. For instance, in a provider in a healthcare setting, because they have a. So you can't just say someone's vulnerable because they're depressed or someone's vulnerable because they're in a wheelchair. There are certain conditions that may be universally vulnerable. Someone with significant dementia, someone with uh, unending psychosis or mania or delirium, yes. But most of the time, or many of the cases, there has to be a consideration of both the physical, psychological, or cognitive status in terms of the abuse and its consequences, which is why it says or its consequences. And therefore vulnerability may be defined differently under different types of perpetration behaviors with the same individual physical status. The example I just gave, in a wheelchair, another one. Now, let's say that exact example, the emotional, the verbal abuse was with respect to that person's amputation and things like that. Then it becomes a little bit more difficult. So we can look at also the abuse and its consequences. Would that be the same consequence to anybody if you're insulted on the street? We don't violate a person's autonomy because we saw someone else curse them out and it didn't seem to bother them too much, right? So the balance, what we're trying to do here is balance beneficence. We should support a report to Adult Protective Services or police all abusive behavior defined writ large. That's beneficence versus autonomy, respect. The person doesn't want you to report it. At what point do we ignore their wants and desires and report it anyway? Well, for children, we say every point at any point. If you're under 18, bam. For older adults, in some states, it's 60 or 65. If you're over 65, bam. But in others, it's no, only with a
Mm.
vulnerability. And every state has this consideration for those 18 to 60 or 18 to 65. And so it's an interaction between the type of vulnerability and the type of abuse as defined by increasing risk of the abuse and or its consequences. That's what I hope the pragmatic example is useful because at the end of the day, that's what this is for. What is a
Mhm.
provider supposed to do? What is, a bank manager supposed to do in a potential financial exploitation example? And a 35-year-old wants to send the entire fortune to Russia for that Russian bride and they don't seem to have any obvious psychosis at the moment or obvious cognitive status issues, we might have to respect their autonomy. Whereas if somebody is got mild dementia or if somebody is intermittently manic, we may want to, consider that psychological vulnerability, which might not be vulnerability in other contexts. Anyway, that's the whole thing. It always helps, I think, if you start at the end, the provider or bank manager or neighbor who is observing the situation and wants to help, but doesn't want to violate autonomy or respect.
Thank
Ron,
you.
this is Shannon. I really appreciate your example, and I think it does really elevate kind of these big concepts that we chewed on this morning, and just want to kind of underscore again that your example, I think, in many ways exhibits how, again, vulnerability isn't necessarily, an inherent piece of the person, the individual, but instead looking at the interaction and the flex of that individual within their environment, with their relationships and other dynamics within their life. And so I think all of those pieces are important for us to understand. So, of course, as we were chewing on these concepts, part of the discussion also went to, so how do we think about it through a model approach? And, how do we show the interaction of so many factors upon each other? And so, again, these are the pieces that we continue to try to work on and think about the relationships. Again, what is the definition of vulnerability? How do we think about the types of vulnerability? How do we think about duration? How do we then move into the interaction and types of even what maltreatment means? And so this is kind of the evolution, if you will, the example he gave of how we were thinking through these key concepts.
Thank you, Shannon. Shannon, can I call you in to just also elucidate something that's probably fairly relevant for this? You were talking about vulnerability within the realm, like within social terms of health perspectives in your email. And I
Yes.
think that'll be really salient because part of what we were talking about in the meeting was also trying to represent, vulnerability because of, undocumented status and vulnerability because of power differentials. So if you can just be your raw self, and that would be lovely because I'm sure that the community would love to hear that.
Well, I think again, it builds on this aspect of vulnerability not being specific or inherent trait of a person. And again, looking at the interactions and the context
Mhm.
of the individual. So again, the type of vulnerability that's present, the type of maltreatment that's occurring or at risk for the individual, the timing and the duration of the vulnerability, and even the relational and contextual aspect that it occurs. And to your point, Sarah, we were trying to really think through as we were trying to, I think, dig into duration. So again, if it's temporary, again, short-lived, how does that elevate risk if we're talking about a very defined period of time? So again, the type of examples, someone might be recovering from an injury or recovering from a surgery that, provides a shorter context of that vulnerability, or intermittent as we think about more reoccurring, again, cycles of depression or neurological condition relapse, again, trying to provide that more episodic condition where things may fluctuate versus a more chronic or abiding. These are the terms that we're using right now as we think about more long-term or enduring conditions that create more of a consistent risk exposure. So again, the examples there may be more congenital disability, a chronic mental illness, or thinking through systemic marginalization. Again, I think that where our thinking will evolve ahead, though, will play into this aspect of understanding duration plays into kind of more chronic forms of vulnerability and how it can compound over time. It can create greater risk and even reducing access to protective factors. And I know we used that term last time, but building on protective factors, whether it's social support, whether it's autonomy, whether, again, Lucy, what you brought up, financial stability, or even accessible services. How do we think about these protective factors and how they play into either facilitating or deterring aspects of vulnerability? So I think this is a really important conversation that we had. And Sarah, we kind of continue it via email, but really just would appreciate any thoughts or reflections as we continue to flesh these concepts out.
Thank you, Shannon. And I want to pull in the comment I replied to Patricia because we literally got to the end of the meeting and we're starting to unpack the word abuse and think about all the different possible words we could use. And we put a pin in it, right? So I
Yes.
just want to note we were right at the cusp and we're like, okay, so we have this and we have this and we have this. we need to circle back around on this, right? And so absolutely salient. We need to go deeper in that. And that is the one thing I should have put like still, well, it's all TBD. But and then, we did pair our abuse concepts with our legal experts, which I love. Omar is calling is commenting. He's one of our legal needs experts. And your comment in there is very salient as well. Do you want to say anything more further on that, Omar, or just your comment stands?
No, just adding a little bit more context to that
Yeah.
um, piece. So just wanted to keep that on.
Love it. Okay, and we'll take that and put it into our sandbox with our work as well. Any other further comments from our subject matter experts? I mean, again, we don't have a ton of material to present today because we really are in exploratory mode. Um, any other comment from a subject matter expert or a community member?
Sarah, the only other comment I would add is that the intent is also to acknowledge complexity.
Mhm.
Some of the conversations tend to be narrow. They sometimes sort of assume that there's one particular type of experience that may be at play, but we all come in packages that at the same time manifest different characteristics, represent different positions in different systems, etc. So, this is a beginning for us. The level of nuance that most of us might not be here at this point, but our intent is to be able to have gateways into those discussions so that, for example, conversations about things like social isolation, which
Mhm.
isn't explicitly addressed in the definition that we have right now, become possible. Treatment of things like, one of the individuals in the comments mentioned earlier, exploitation, neglect, other concepts that tend to be related to abuse as the first point of discussion are also on the table, for us to talk about in a larger context. Oh,
Thank you, Jeff. Lucy?
Yeah, I'm just going to comment as a non-expert interested party that the word abuse to me is stronger than the word harm. In other words, harm can potentially, it's a little bit more abstract. When I read abuse, I actually instantly think of physical violence, which is clearly not all that's going on in this definition. If it said harm, harm to me is a much broader, vaguer idea, and therefore could encompass more and could point people to think more conscientiously about something they're observing or hearing. Does this constitute harm? Nobody's being beaten up here or dragged around physically, but is harm occurring? So I just wanted to contribute that to your conversations.
And thank you, Lucy. And I'm reading, of course, our friend Patricia is bringing in.
Yeah, I never thought about until it was just mentioned by our experts. So thank you about, we look at disability in ICF as this overarching negative term, right? If it's a limitation in activities or it's a restriction in participation, and it's that individual within their environment, that dynamic interaction. So as you perhaps increase barriers, which could be, harmful factors, you could then create the disability. So similarly, like when we think about vulnerability in that kind of lens, ICF lens, it's again that negative interaction between an individual, whatever, and our health condition is very broad, right? So whatever
Mhm.
that is, could be age, right? In respective of this conversation today, and their contextual factors. And that's what creates perhaps the susceptibility, and it's very dynamic. And it doesn't then rest vulnerability within that person as an inherent trait, but that dynamic state between the components. And it is broad enough that it lends itself to differentiation like social isolation and exploitation and so forth. But never thought about it till this call. So thank you. Interesting. Yeah.
Very appreciative of all of
Hmm.
you and this stuff.
And thank you for your patience too. Because one of the things also that came up in our conversation this morning, there can be literacy related vulnerabilities, and the social context within which we live is constantly evolving. So how do we accommodate shifts in, positioning and context over time?
Yeah, we even in one of the earlier calls when we looked at, neighborhood stability factors and so forth, and baby bonds as a economic intervention, a protective factor. I mean, children who are born into certain circumstances, right, may also be subject to a lot of vulnerability. And having programs like that are perhaps wealth building interventions like a baby bonds would be a protective factor. So it's very, I mean, very interesting because again, it spills over into the children population as well. I don't have an answer.
I know. Well, we don't need it. We don't need lot. We need good questions right now more than we need good answers. This is it. We're only just beginning. Yes, Lucy, we were talking about that. Any other thoughts? Again, it is a this is a deck with a few slides on each domain and hopefully just bringing the community into the conversations that we're having and ensuring the community's wisdom is brought back in because there's a lot we'll capture from the chat and from your comments and fold into our conversation with the subject matter experts as we convene again.
Sarah, I just had another awful thought based on what I just put in the chat. Vulnerability can be created by policy.
Correct. We were just talking about that this
And
morning.
actually,
100%.
the whole concept of structural racism creates vulnerability for the targets of whatever the structural racism component is or is going to be. So in the conversation, when we end up with a definition that we think we can live with,
Well, I actually
I guess vulnerability created by policy should not be, I don't know, I'm just throwing this out, should not
well,
be encompassed in our definition, or should it? Okay.
well, we actually started from trying to describe the different types of vulnerability and then we backed away. Right. And instead, what happened is we flipped because there's so many different types. And so that's partly why the SMEs created this phrase, which is already emerging and changing. Um, these core common states or another state that leads to a higher risk of abuse or its consequences, which fundamentally can include structural forces and policy. There's a lot in there, right? And again, more to come. Jeff asked everyone to be patient, but I want you to say, Lucy, I want you to hear that like our SMEs are leading us and we're delving it. There we go. Yes. And Jeff is already weighing in. But that's not. And then there was a lot in Shannon's email that she's not mentioning today. But suffice to say, this is very much, and Jeff was calling it intersectionality. So that's very apropos for the conversations we're having. We were talking about the social ecological model in the child abuse domain, but also this morning in the non-elder vulnerable adults domain. So very much apropos.
And Sarah, this is Shannon.
Hi.
Not sure how much we wanted to dive into each piece, but all the examples that are being put in the chat box and being raised, we actually started to highlight this morning and continued through our discussion. And so we were bringing up again immigration status and language barriers and discrimination and isolation and thinking through many of those as examples, but instead of calling them out as specific states. Instead, I think they can play into the physical, emotional, cognitive, but then again, the larger other state that's more encompassing, right? The other category. But I just want to highlight that the examples that are being elevated in this discussion, keep them coming, because it's so helpful to continue to talk as a community here, right? That all of us are very interested in making sure that these terms, these concepts have greater use in how we're thinking through it. But that also, instead of having, kind of a checklist of vulnerabilities, there are ways to create these broader buckets that then encompass the examples that I think we're bringing up as a collective. So appreciative of all the discussion and the suggestions and thoughts that are being elevated, and we will continue to use those to frame and reframe these key concepts. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I hope this was a salient and thoughtful. This is the introduction to really, this is the first time the subject matter expertise is laid to bear, right? So we did our kickoff of lit, but this is very, very grateful for these experts and their guidance. We are actively exploring many of the things that you brought up today, and we look forward to coming back in 2 weeks, folding in your wisdom, pulling through the things that our SMEs are already discussing, and with further refinement. Sound good? I'm going to say that over and over and over again. There's just a couple slides for every domain. Okay. Are we good? Moving on. Some non-elder, vulnerable adult SMEs, you are brilliant. Please stay with us if you can. I know Ron is double booked, and grateful for you. So grateful. Okay, next slide. I think that was it. Yeah. Oh, no, we just brought in again just the we didn't remove this slide from before, which is the role protection and advocacy agencies have in many reports of concerns with APS. Next slide. All right, so now on to child maltreatment, which is going to have some themes that are in common with the previous domain and some things that are different. And for child maltreatment, we have the amazing Dr. Scavano here, and we'll see if he can speak to things if he has if he has good audio. Usually our SMEs are going to tap one person to come to the call, so there's one person to carry, just so that everyone doesn't have to be here all the time. We're very grateful that all the and then so Omar is here for legal needs, and then Dr. Scavano is here for child maltreatment. Next slide. These are our amazing child maltreatment experts. We have Dr. Emily Brown from UW. We have Dr. Catherine or Kathy Wells from U Colorado. And we have Dr. Phil Scribano from CHOP and many places. We are immensely grateful for these three brilliant folks who are all child abuse specialists within pediatrics, and many have been leaders and thought leaders in this field for a very long time. Very grateful. Next slide. So again, I'm going to see if Dr. Phil, you're welcome to come in and speak anytime you want to. We have changed our definition already, and Patricia, you're going to love this. So we went to the WHO definition. Yeah. I know when you said that note last, and then that last one, I'm like, just wait. And so a couple of things that we just want to solidify, although initially scoped as child abuse, we said this last time, we're just doubling down. All of our SMEs agree that we are considering actually maltreatment and an inclusive of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse and neglect. Right. And we're exploring things that are in addition to that, but that's just, it is now the child maltreatment domain. It is not the child abuse domain. Henceforward, you'll see this in all comps. Our definition changed for a few reasons. One is to ground in clinical rather than legal references, because we had some legal statute references before. and to aim for international applicability that we always try to do, right? We always try to have. And so the WHO definition is child maltreatment is the abuse and neglect of people under 18 years of age. It includes all forms of physical and emotional ill treatment, sexual abuse, neglect, or negligent treatment, or commercial or other exploitation, resulting in actual or potential harm to the child's health, survival, development, or dignity in the context of a relationship of responsibility, trust, or power. 4 types of child maltreatment are generally recognized: physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological or emotional or mental abuse, and neglect. So this is the definition we are using at this time to ground our work. Lucy?
In the middle of this WHO definition, it talks about commercial or other exploitation. And then at the bottom, 4 types are recognized. Commercial or other isn't in this list. Could somebody explain where commercial or other fits in these 4 types generally recognized?
I can go back to the WHO resource and get that for you. It might be a copy and paste error on my part, Lucy. I want to assume that it's that before I do anything else.
Okay, well, we're not going to change the WHO definition, obviously.
Correct. That's why I'm thinking, yeah.
So I'm just raising this so that at least I and potentially others on the call feeling grateful that commercial exploitation is mentioned here, but then I don't see it at the bottom. So thank you for pursuing that.
Of course.
Yeah, I think it's from where it came from. So the first part, I think, comes just like that's like the overarching perhaps definition. And then the types, yeah, I think it's just from maybe two related sources, maybe. That's why there's a little bit
Well,
of
it's
a
one
disconnect.
para. It's
Is
all
it one
they're all
paragraph, really?
yeah. But I think I might have left off another sentence that added further. I'm going to own that. I think it's like a transcription error as opposed to a definition
Okay,
error.
okay,
Yeah.
That's fine, Sarah. Thank you.
okay,
And I'll
thanks.
just add that there are many other types of maltreatment that are not listed in this
Correct.
definition. And so as it is, it's a long definition. So there may have been some editor
Mm.
prerogative to try to be inclusive with exploitation, but to narrow it down to where the majority of uh, activity, if you will, in the health sector relates to those 4 types. Exploitation, sexual exploitation, as an example, is covered in sexual abuse. We would say that that is in some way covered. It's just the manner by which a child is victimized, vis-a-vis exploited for specific material gain, as opposed to sexual gratification, perhaps, as the ways in which these layers and nuances of definitions may come about. I think it's a good point in terms of commercial exploitation or labor is what is typically thought of, and that is sort of in its own category that is not picked up on the 4 types. So to Lucy's point, it may be just trying to provide brevity. Although Sarah, if you take a look, maybe there's a transcription error. I don't know.
I think there's a lot out there. Might just be the generally might be doing a lot of work there. Right. So I think but I'll look into it and then I'll review it with the SMEs on Tuesday and then come back.
And my audio work today, Sarah?
It does. Hi.
Great to be home as opposed to
No.
in a multi-million-dollar building at the hospital.
Phil was in like, CHOP fancy research building on Tuesday with horrible internet connection. So we were laughing about that. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so we're now going to go a little bit deeper. Any questions on this? Any further thoughts or comments? I'm going to look into I think the truth is that I think there was a further sentence. I think I could have just left off the last sentence is and had it be sufficient. But we'll come back. I'll do whatever the SMEs tell us to do. I'll do my little, my editing look and then come back. Any other thoughts on this slide before we move on? Okay, next slide. All right, so there's going to be lots to say on the next slide. I felt like before we got into subject matter expert choices on approaches to standardized instruments, I needed to remind everybody what our general approach to instruments is. And Phil, this builds off some conversations we were having on Tuesday, right? So gravity, cure, because there's in some of our domains, incarceration, ACEs, child maltreatment, conversations about standardized instruments are very appropriate, right? And we figure out why, like, what's the purpose of screening? Is it helpful, beneficence, non-malfeasance? These are the things that come to mind. So, gravity curates evidence-based standardized assessment instruments that can be used for multiple purposes. That's a true statement, right? Some are used for screening. This has been secondary prevention and early detection within either focused or general populations. Like you can give an instrument to everybody, or you can give it like an instrument to some people. And the point is to identify unidentified things, right? We also develop curate assessment instruments that are used for deep analysis of phenomena across standard dimensions, right? The USDA 18-item food insecurity instrument is not intended to be a screening instrument. The ACEBA that we use in child psychology and development assessment, not intended to be a screening instrument. It is a standardized method of deep understanding and analysis across predictable phenomena of a concern, right? We also use standardized instruments for surveillance. These are used for population level prevalence without ties to specific patients or episodes of care. We think about things like the BRIFIS or the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and they might contain screening instruments, like instruments that are used for screening, but it's a different purpose. They're anonymized, you don't have any PHI in there. It's just like this happens. This is a national prevalence of this, right? And so these are important because when you look at instruments and their psychometric validity, sometimes instruments are only valid for one of these purposes. They haven't been tested in other settings, or they're too long for screening, or right? These are all things that we just consider when we look at instruments. We uncover a lot of instruments in gravity that are used for surveillance because of our focus on social determinants of health. Sometimes we elevate those instruments if there's reason to into instruments for clinical use, right? But this is just like where we sit at gravity. Does that all make sense? Like the land of standardized instruments. Okay. Sometimes instruments, as I mentioned, are useful for multiple purposes, right? Like the hunger vital sign is a 2-item food insecurity instrument. It's used for screening in clinical settings and surveillance in the Youth Risk Behavior Survey and BRIFIS. And so it's doing both purposes, right? But some instruments are just designed for specific purposes only, and we note this when it's relevant. Like our food insecurity subject matter experts from Children's Health Watch just validated a short version of the USDA 18-item food insecurity instrument, and they were very adamant. This is an assessment instrument. It is not a screening instrument. We were like, thank you very much, right? That's just important to consider. Okay, so now with that understood, we're going to go into the next slide. All right. Okay. Bill, this is like, this is where we are, right? There's conflicting evidence on the risk-benefit of screening for child maltreatment, and we reviewed options with our subject matter experts, right? We presented them with an option of include no standardized instruments. That because the evidence about the risk-benefit is insufficient, and there's concern that there's too much risk. We did that with incarceration. Right? We were like, there is no way that screening for incarceration is safe enough at this moment in time to put any standardized instrument into the ecosystem. We will not do it, right? Our SMEs were like, right? We could have included standardized instruments with the indication that they should only be used with deeper assessment. I never for secondary prevention and early identification, but just kind of like a deeper understanding purpose. Or we could, and Phil, I hope this is tracking. Or we could like support standardized instruments that can be used for both screening and assessment with clear guardrails. And these are our guardrail themes that came out hot off the press on Tuesday, right? Use instruments that are validated in specific settings within those settings. So if it's an emergency room instrument that is helpful in emergency rooms, we advise that it be used in emergency rooms until it's proven to be useful other places. Right? I mean, I say we, I'm like y'all, I should say. Use instruments that are validated with specific professions, roles, or training within their profession, role, or training. Right? So especially if it's like this instrument requires a significant amount of training to be used to the best benefit of the patient, right? Our subject matter experts were comfortable with that, right? And some instruments are developed for use with social workers, and some instruments are developed for use for psychologists, and we just noted those things, and that was one of the guardrail themes we have so far. Phil, did I summarize it
You
well?
nailed it.
What?
You nailed it.
Okay,
And
good.
I'll just say, to summarize the issues of generalizability related to screens, uh, they weren't designed for the generalizability in the clinical context, and that really matters. And so we worry about the um, the validity and the reliability. And as a result of that, if the science isn't good, we don't want to cause harm by virtue of using a tool that wasn't really designed for the intent, the purpose that it's being used in clinical practice. And that's unfortunately a common uh, practice and a vulnerability. The second is fidelity. And one instrument in particular is a good scale for physical abuse only in an emergency department setting with substantial training that nurses undergo to be able to have the screening characteristics, the sensitivity, specificity, predictive values that have been reported on that screen. And so we know the sloppiness of how these get used. And given, again, the potential harms, we wanted to put these guardrails in place. And the last comment I'll make is we have external pressures, regulatory pressures, Joint Commission in particular, that are requiring screens that are not validated, requiring things that are not uh, useful and potentially harmful. If this is recorded, I don't really care, because I think that these are the kinds of realities that we have to grapple with. And then what ends up happening, our EMRs, I'll say good companies want to be responsive to their users and start to build these out into their systems. And so there's a lot here that uh, creates a lot of angst for us. So that's where we spend a lot of time. I think most of our time really grappling with this reality and the challenges that are presented around screening, assessments, instruments, and screening instruments and assessment instruments. And so this was a lot of conversation that I think we landed well, but it took us a little bit to get there.
And I want to note that I think you all helped us explicate a sensitivity that has been expressed across other domains, right? Because of the paucity of science. Like in the realm of social determinants of health, there are not very many robust instruments that we know have been evaluated deeply to ensure that they more often than not result in good outcomes for the patient from a beneficence standpoint, like it's actually worth the salt. And so we you all helped us kind of name something that has been that balancing desire to identify needs with the evidence of like the deep psychometric analysis of whether it's actually helping the patient. We sit in that on a regular basis with our work, of course. Lucy.
These guardrail themes, the second bullet,
Hmm.
if I'm a family practitioner, perceived and expected to be the first line of the front line for a new client or a new patient, does this say that I shouldn't be using any of the standardized assessment instruments that we eventually come up with? That I have to make a referral to a social worker or a psychologist or a trained RN?
You can
What are,
assess things without standardized instruments. I'm just going to be very careful. Just like that's my initial response, and I see Phil nodding. Like I don't use a single standardized instrument for child maltreatment in my practice. I identify risk for child maltreatment and lean in to prevent it every day of my job, right? Whether they be structural risks, socio-ecological models coming next, Phil. But I just want to note that just because we're saying don't use a standardized instrument, it does not mean don't assess. Is that helpful, Lucy? I should have let Phil talk, but so you said family practice, and I'm the family practice girl. Lucy, does that make sense? You're muted, so I'm having a hard time.
yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm certainly in no position to have a final judgment here. So I'm interested in the conversation. And
Okay.
I'm talking definitely from the health sector point of view, where family practice has been promoted and elaborated for 60 years as a frontline health worker. So as you've just said, you see it every day. So what do you do?
Oh,
And eventually, we're going to end up, Corey, with coding. And if I have to eventually either assign a code or validate somebody else assigning a code, and I haven't used an instrument, I'm just using my instinct and experience, is that okay?
the absence of an instrument does not mean the absence of a diagnostic criteria, right? Does that make sense? Phil, you go, and then or
Yeah,
Patricia,
no,
you're both capable. Yeah.
I think this is where in our field there's a lot of passionate discussion around the
I'll bet.
limitations of our science and the over reliance on these kinds of tools to diagnose a highly complex,
Mm.
issue as a diagnosis. And so if you have good clinical experience and you're a good clinician, I would argue that that's probably better than what is out there right now,
Okay.
unless you've had a good understanding of that tool. And I mentioned the emergency department physical abuse screener. A lot of uh, dependence on the training is what drives your psychometric your characteristics of that screener. Um, Anything short of that um, starts to open up a door, a can of worms, whatever phrase you want to use, and can cause harm. And we may not do it right. And your clinical expertise is really what is needed more than, did I use a screen that's been published in the literature? So that was the sort of the discussion. I honestly we come to the conclusion that we don't believe that these are ready for prime time, and wanted to make sure that from an ethical standpoint, we weren't endorsing. I think this is really where the heart of the conversation was going. Didn't want to be feeling like by virtue of our acquiescence to screens in this effort, we were endorsing screens. And so Sarah helped us with framing it in the way in which we did.
But just what to do, also, you didn't want to disable elevating screens in
Correct.
those instances where they're actually evidence-based and helpful. Like there's these two, you were,
The tension.
yeah, the tension. Patricia.
Yeah, and I appreciate it with Phil, your response, because I think in social work, certainly, we use evidence, whatever that might be. It could be observations, right? It could be initial signs. It can be a hunch, right? Some social workers, a teacher, right? Anybody who's a mandated reporter. And then that is what triggers, and it's the investigation that utilizes a more standardized protocol, including some sort, usually it's multi-assessments, right? Because you have to assess the child. Yeah, there's an examination, physical examination, especially in those cases. There's family assessments, but my concern was, and I think Phil, you already said it too, is that like when I put in the chat, like in Illinois, I mean, this is state by state, right? So in Illinois, the child endangerment risk assessment protocol is used, and that's built into legislation. So we're now specifying a specific type of assessment. If you're in Illinois and you're saying, if gravity's saying use this assessment because it has probably a different assessment, let's say it's very good psychometric or validated, findings, then Illinois is going to say, well, but this is not what we have built into our legislation, right? We have this particular one, the CRAP, and that has had mixed results, right? So in terms of validation. So I appreciated what you're saying in terms of what everyone's saying, Sarah, too, about using something that is validated, but it's hard to discern what that is, and then not, looking at perhaps the legality, looking more of a clinical model for these things, but there's still going to be a legal ramification, right? Because if you're in a certain state, by law, unless you change the law, you're going to have to use a specific assessment.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And
I
then
guess
Rob,
I'm
I know,
thinking,
just want, oh,
I'm
sorry, I want to
sorry.
make sure we have Rob raising his hand, and then Lucy, we can get to you. And I do want to make sure we move to the next domain just from a timeliness perspective, because we're at 5:09 or Eastern Standard Time. Rob?
Yeah, yeah, no,
Hi,
hey, this is
Rob.
quick, but it's not simple. So I hear all these great comments about this kind of capturing the nuances about applying this particular thing that we potentially will approve versus that one in a particular setting. And what's kind of in my head is that this is an HL7 IG. It is intended to align with the technical expectations of the fire IGs that we produce. There's, what I'm about to say is certainly aspirational for even IGs that are not as kind of informational as this one is, but I do think there needs to be some serious thought about how you clearly, technically, as well as not verbally, but
And
written,
usage guidance or something
yeah,
besides
the guidance, right? I mean, clearly what you're describing is guidance.
Mhm.
But we have an obligation to craft technical guardrails, just like use that same word, around how that gets applied. And so I would expect in the conversation with the SMEs and with Susan and others that we find the right terms that get applied in kind of coded specific ways to
Mhm.
capture that guidance. And then if you can't, which is, I'll have to say likely, then you have to be very clear about saying that so that people who come in and read this as guidance understand the expectation that they should try and strive for that, right? Even if you can't unfortunately tell them how to do it. So anyway, that's my point. I think these
Yeah.
are all good things, and it's frequent that we spend a lot of time getting guidance things out and we write them down, but they have to translate into technical guardrails wherever possible.
It seems like that's possible. If we have an ED only instrument, we can, we have width.
Yeah, well, okay. I mean, I hear you say that, and that's good. And it is true that you can,
Possible.
it is possible, and then people actually have to do what you've told
No,
them
I
to do.
know. Like Corey, poor Corey's over there going, Sarah.
But anyway, no, good. I'm glad that you've said that, and I'm glad that you're thinking about it. Thanks.
I know. I know. My dear friend Corey is like, that's nice, Sarah. It's nice that you said that's possible. I know. And there's roles and professions. These are all codable constructs, Phil, in the work we do. Um, we just if Rob's asking us to put teeth into our guardrails, it's a good thing to talk about. Okay, so I'm going to move us along. Thank you, Rob, for your wisdom. Next slide. Uh, this is just a placeholder. Um, I'm just looking, what a brilliant. Yes. Thank you, Jeff Hall. Um, this is so Phil, this is our social ecological model placeholder for all the wisdom you guys will drop, right? We pulled this from the CDC. So as part of our work with the SMEs, we reviewed existing models that describe social ecological model and opportunities for both child maltreatment understanding and child maltreatment prevention, right? And feel free. So we looked at current models, and our brilliant SMEs noted a couple themes. There were opportunities for addition of missing elements, like in like relationship, there or in individual. There were things our SMEs like that's not there, and that's not there, and that's not there, right? And then the model we looked at totally didn't have a societal and policy bit, and our SMEs are like, that's not okay. Because they would include that. So we're gonna work in it together. We're gonna drop things in here and then co-create a model that's appropriate for this work. So I just want to leave place for that because we all acknowledge that this is the work we do. And then we also talked about in our non-elder vulnerable adult abuse concept doing the same thing. Like we could do the same thing there. The existence of a perfect model wasn't found, so we'll make it together. And they were like, Phil was like, let's do it. So Phil says, let's do it. I'm like, okay. And then, I mean, this should make sense. We've talked about this a million times before. And our friend, social worker, I see you nodding there. I see you nod. I see you nodding. Okay. That is the conclusion of what we have right now for child maltreatment. And we're going to segue into legal needs. And with, I hope we should, should have time. Omar, I'm very sorry. You're very patient. Okay. Phil, thank you. Next slide. Again, we only have a couple slides with this work, so hopefully we will have all the expertise laid to bear. These are our amazing legal needs subject matter experts. It's so fun to be surrounded by so many lawyers. I'm here to tell you, I am learning so much. They are brilliant. I know, but I'm not joking. Like, brilliant, Omar. It is such a, a pleasure. So Jeremy Spiegel, supervising attorney at Camden Coalition MLP. Someone who might remember the amazing Dr. Marcia Regenstein, professor of Milken Institute of Public Health at GW. And she used to be at the National Center for Medical Legal Partnership, and that's how we brought her back in. Omar Martinez, professor, Department of Population Health Sciences, College of Medicine, University of Central Florida, director of Implementation Science Research Lab. That's a long title. So fun. Amar, we're having a very, very brilliant. And then Teresa Brabson, the executive director of Legal Clinic for the Disabled, LCD. Brilliant, wonderful subject matter experts who, we brought in and contracted some ethicists to help us review our incarceration status domain, both for primary and secondary uses, just from the bias perspective. I feel like I'm sitting with ethicists every single day when I meet with these SMEs. I'm like, it's just so great. Okay. Next slide. There's a lot of themes here, and Amar, please feel free to weigh in if we didn't capture anything that came from the meeting on Tuesday. One of the things, and there's a lot of caution in these slides, a lot of caution that resembles some of the themes we're talking about in child maltreatment and the abuse of non-elder vulnerable adults. Legal experts that we have gathered, our SMEs, are generally discussing the challenges of overspecifying legal matters in clinical settings due to the need for further legal assessment by legal professionals. There's a general theme of don't overly identify what you think is the problem, just get them to us. Right? We can delve deeper. And I just want to note, because they're experts, right? I just want to note this aligns with a referral for further assessment use case that we developed in our STU, our third version of implementation guide, right? When acknowledging that you need someone who's an expert to further assess this. So I just wanted to call that in. Within legal diagnoses, they're exploring using inclusive terminology, legal need, not civil legal need or criminal legal need. And there's two different lenses that the experts are looking at this from. One is the highest level might be able to mitigate risk of bias in naming needs within the criminal legal system, right? So if you say somebody has a criminal legal need, that is a mark, right? And a risk of bias, the same lens that we have with incarceration. And we also note that keeping it highest level allows legal entities and experts to address both civil and criminal issues broadly without having to differentiate, right? So that is the lens we're looking at now. And again, Omar, I hope you're still on the call. Feel free to counter anything I'm saying. I think actually, oh no, I saw your thumb, so you're still here.
Yep. No,
Okay.
you're doing a great job.
Okay. Okay, great. Another thing that is a theme is really we looked at existing terminology. There is a legal problem concept in SNOMED right now. And our SMEs had really thoughtful exploration about the difference between stating a legal need from a patient perspective and assessing a legal need if you're a legal professional. Oh, I'm sorry, a legal problem if you're a legal professional. Because Teresa gave this use case of sometimes the grandmother comes in and she has this concern for this legal problem that's related to her non-custodial child, right? And she still needs legal help, but it's not her legal problem, right? And so there was a need for within the medical legal partnership framework for anyone to say, I have something that I need help with, right? And then frame legal problem maybe as the outcome of that assessment, right? By a legal professional. And this relates to some of the MLP, and I hope that makes sense. We also, when we talked on Tuesday about how we use the difference between risk and social need within that same patient prioritized lens based on the Hugh Alderwick and Laura Gottlieb meanings and misunderstandings framework, right? So when someone says, I need help with that, and it's a patient voice, we're accustomed to that, right? And then another thing that we identified was that we did want to explore this health harming legal need concept in addition to the existing legal problems concept. We're exploring how relevant that is for international use. There's extensive conversation and use of the term legal need in the works of OECD, World Health Organization. You know, that's a salient term across the international ecosystem. So we're exploring health harming legal needs because it's very salient within MLP conversations, within US conversations, and we're exploring it internationally, but definitely was salient from the work of medical legal partnerships and the literature there. Omar,
You,
did I miss anything?
no, you did great. But also, Sarah, you mentioned something about risk, and I want to capture that component too, because the whole idea of preventive legal aid, right? So you may not
Yeah.
have the legal need as of now, but
Mm,
potentially in the future, you may be at risk of housing instability, right?
mhm,
Being
mhm.
evicted. So I want us to think also about that risk component. You may not have it now, right? But you may encounter that in the future. You see what I'm saying? So that's
I
where
do, yeah.
I appreciate your risk component into the discussion here.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. All right, so this is diagnoses, conversations. Let's talk about interventions, goals, and outcomes. Next slide. Oh yeah, so Patricia, so we presented the iHelp framework last time, which has all of those things, right? Yeah, so we are not one of the things that we're exploring with the subject matter experts is whether we want to bind concepts like legal need affecting housing, legal need affecting transportation security, or whether we want to leave it high level and separate. We didn't get to that yet, but if you remember from incarceration, the combining to differentiate civil legal problems from past criminal problems was really critical for the incarceration SMEs because of bias and because of the complicated, like getting your license again is a complicated thing with a history of incarceration. That's a civil problem complicated by a history, right? So that's all in the hopper. I hope I did a good job. Okay. This is some pretty, like, this is another conversation on risk, on like caution. This is caution. Well, I should have a little caution sign. Legal experts have expressed clear caution about developing and sending detailed outcome and intervention information back to clinical settings. Because we usually develop all the programs and professions and things that happen, all the activities of the legal profession. And they're cautious about this due to the possibility of risk and bias to the patient and client and the lack of clear benefit. So we last time we were here, we're exploring of having to add legal activities to our intervention framework. And our amazing lawyers were like, why? Like, you don't need to know what's happening over here. Or and not, I'm sorry, Omar, that was very flippant, but it was more like you should be on a need to know basis. Sorry, you can see I'm talking with lawyers, so I have to like make sure I'm talking correctly. But that's new for us, right? So like we're used to like desiring all of this information about what happened, right? And our lawyers and our experts are like, we'll talk about it, right? We're exploring high level outcomes, like maybe like, hi, I did it. I addressed the legal need. Don't worry, clinical person. We're exploring communicating the status of whatever domain was affected, Patricia, from that iHelp framework, like housing, fine, move on, like, tenancy, like eviction prevented or something to that effect. But even that is like exploring. They're also exploring it as a maximum, one of our amazing um, designated record set. Patricia, I'm gonna ask you, I might ask Omar to explain what you're saying, but they're exploring as a maximum communicating only information available through the public court records, but even then they have concerns. They're like, just because it's available in a court record, it does not mean we feel like it needs to be documented in clinical settings. So all of that caution is guiding our conversation on interventions, goals, and outcomes, which is new for us. And Omar gave a thumbs up. Okay, great. And then Patricia, did your question get answered?
Kind of, because I was just thinking, because we had a conversation about in Passio about the designated record set and understanding that, those records, right, can get released, right, under HIPAA to patients, but then there are clinical records that are restricted and not released, let's say like maybe psychotherapy notes. So could
Okay.
some of the stuff that you're talking about be necessary for clinical decision making or what have you? And
Yeah.
but could they be restricted separate information that are not subject to HIPAA?
Okay. We
Those
will.
are, yeah, that's a great point. But then there's also the attorney-client privilege, right?
Ooh.
So any communication that happens between the client, that information is privileged. So I think that that's where we're talking about here, right?
Okay. Okay, I
And
got
that
it.
is
Thanks. Okay.
privilege. Yeah, yeah,
I'm following you now. I'm just,
I
yeah,
not a
didn't say
lawyer.
that.
Not a
Okay.
lawyer. I'm a social worker.
yeah.
Phil?
Yeah, I was keying in on the attorney-client privilege. The one nuance I would want to raise is the impact that any referral for these services um, is, in a sense, a prescription, an order that is written by or provided by a provider, and that them on the hook And if there is no sense that that handoff has been successful,
Hmm.
there's actually risk. And so, to the extent that some documentation that a successful handoff has occurred is really all I think is
Hmm.
needed, and that would satisfy the attorney-client privilege. So, satisfy the medical legal risks related to the organization, or should say the provider, in assuring that that has been referred and that there's, at least an accountability for owning that. So I don't know if that was part of the discussion, but I know that's
It
something that
was,
for
and I
SDOH,
forgot it.
what we were talking about at length in our build in our institution related to the anxiety providers have of not knowing
Mm,
what happened when you made referrals. What, was there a response by the work? Did they attend to the housing or the food or whatever the need was identified? And having, again, a cryptic level, yep, I'm on it, got it. And
mhm.
you leave it at that. I want to just bring that up.
Phil, of course, you identified the thing that I forgot to put on the slide. Because we did talk about the capacity to technically, within a service request, within like demonstrate the research, like I got it. Like you say a referral, and we know our IG can say, got it. And that high level ping of I've received this patient, client, I got them now. That is something that we know we can do, right? Communicate the status of a referral back. And then this is partly why we're talking about the legal use. So thank you for calling for. And then we only have like a minute left. Lucy, do you have a quick email, sorry,
Yeah,
comment?
just from
Oh,
an institutional point of view, I have encountered legal professionals whose primary concern is if we don't do this, we are liable. And so I'm wondering, um, in a future conversation, could our legal experts comment on the liability issue from an institutional point of view? If we don't recommend this, if we don't do this, if we don't have a 360X on this referral, is that okay?
that would be leaning into Phil's question there. I mean, I think we have the right legal team to lean into that.
Now, I
Okay.
really appreciate
Yeah.
the caution that's being introduced here because there could be harm to patients if things are done that don't need to be done. So now I'm just reversing that from a liability point of view. There's a needle that has to be threaded here. Okay, thank you.
Great, great point, Lucy. And you brought up an interesting point that made me think about in medical legal partnerships, you have what we have, like what we think about the patient facing, the attorney for patient facing legal support, and then the attorneys for team facing legal support. So you have
Mhm.
a distinction of roles there. Attorneys providing legal aid, right, to patients, but you also have the team facing legal support, attorneys providing legal advice, consultations, guidance to healthcare teams. Does that make sense? Um, to deal with that liability
Absolutely,
issue.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Thank you.
Amazing. Okay. What a rich hour and a half we have had, friends. That went by very quickly. Um, okay, I think that's it. So our job, so please catch up on everything. Look at the Confluence recording. Yeah. Thank you so